Have you ever found yourself doing something and later wondering, why on earth did I do that? From mindlessly scrolling through your phone when you're bored to snapping at someone when you're hungry, our daily lives are guided by hidden psychological triggers. These triggers are cues that prompt us to act, often without any conscious decision. Some triggers are external, like an enticing aroma that makes you crave food or a phone notification that makes you check a message. Other triggers are internal, arising from our own thoughts, feelings, or physical states. For example, research shows even subtle external cues can influence us unconsciously. In one study, supermarket shoppers bought more French wine when French music was playing, and more German wine with German music. Yet most denied the music affected their choice. This goes to show how triggers can make you tick, driving your behavior without you realizing it. In this video, we'll explore what triggers are and how they operate, with a special focus on internal triggers, those emotional and mental drivers within us. We'll uncover why these hidden influencers cause you to do things on autopilot, delve into examples of internal triggers, from emotional reactions to cognitive biases, and reveal how dark psychology tactics exploit these triggers. Finally, we'll discuss how you can recognize and manage your triggers so you stay in control of your decisions. Let's dive into the psychology of what truly makes you tick. Triggers are essentially any stimulus that prompts a reaction or behavior. Psychologists often distinguish between external triggers and internal triggers. External triggers come from your environment, things you see, hear, smell, or experience around you. They bombard our senses and cue us to act in certain ways. For example, the smell of fresh pie might trigger you to feel hungry and seek a snack, or a notification ping on your phone triggers you to open a message. External triggers are usually observable. You can point to the thing that set you off, the pie, the ping, the person or situation, etc. Internal triggers, on the other hand, come from within. They originate in your own mind and body. These are thoughts, emotions, or physical sensations that spur you to action without any outside cue. Internal triggers can be as obvious as feeling thirst, prompting you to grab water, or as subtle as feeling uneasy in silence, prompting you to turn on the TV. Often, internal triggers are tied to our emotions and mental states. In fact, they're frequently negative feelings that we seek to escape or resolve. Psychology research on habit formation finds that emotions, especially uncomfortable ones like boredom, loneliness, frustration, or anxiety, are powerful internal triggers that can cue habitual behaviors. For instance, feeling lonely might trigger you to mindlessly scroll social media for connection, or feeling indecisive might trigger you to procrastinate. Over time, we learn to associate certain actions as a quick fix for an internal discomfort. As one behavioral expert puts it, when an internal trigger strikes, we often execute a mindless action to ease the negative sensation. External versus internal. Both types of triggers can make you do things without conscious thought, but internal triggers are often the more insidious influence on our behavior. External triggers are easier to notice. You're aware the phone rang or the ad flashed on screen, whereas internal triggers lurk beneath awareness, harder to identify and often seeming to come out of nowhere. In truth, you might not realize I'm doing this because I feel X, you just find yourself doing it. Internal triggers can also be more constant. Our environment isn't always triggering, but our mind and body are always with us. Psychologists note that internal cues like emotional states are often more influential than external cues, precisely because they're hidden from us. We might easily blame the traffic, external, for our irritability, but overlook that our own lack of sleep or stress, internal, is what's really causing us to snap. Crucially, triggers, external or internal, can put us into autopilot mode, where a behavior kicks in without deliberate planning. Our brains are wired to save energy by automating responses to familiar cues. As a habit specialist nicely explains, your brain doesn't wait for a decision, it waits for a cue. Once it arrives, the script runs on autopilot. In other words, when a trigger presents itself, your brain initiates a well-practiced routine. You light up a cigarette when you feel stressed, or you check the fridge whenever you're bored, often without pausing to think it through. The more frequently a trigger and an action occur together, the stronger that link becomes, until the action happens reflexively. It's not that you decided to open Instagram for the 10th time today. It may be that an internal twinge of boredom or anxiety automatically set the habit loop in motion. Recognizing this mechanism isn't about making excuses. It's about understanding the hidden forces behind our behavior. If it feels like, I wasn't even thinking, it just happened, that's likely because a trigger action sequence in your brain bypassed your deliberate thought process. In the next sections, we'll shine a light on some of these internal triggers, the invisible influencers, and how they make you tick. Internal triggers can be thought of as the quiet puppeteers of our behavior, pulling the strings from the inside. They often manifest as a sudden emotion, urge, or thought that pushes you toward a behavior. Because they originate within, we often don't realize when internal triggers are at work. Let's break down some common types of internal triggers that drive actions. Clashes, especially negative ones. Feelings like fear, anxiety, stress, anger, sadness, or shame can trigger immediate reactions. For example, a flash of anger might trigger you to yell at someone before you even think, or a wave of anxiety might trigger you to avoid an uncomfortable task. Often, these emotional triggers are remnants of past experiences. A particular feeling can unconsciously activate old memories or trauma, making you react strongly in the present without realizing why. Feelings of loneliness or abandonment. These vulnerable feelings are potent internal triggers. A pang of loneliness might compel you to call someone or seek validation online. Fear of abandonment can trigger people-pleasing behaviors. You might automatically apologize or accommodate others when you sense someone is upset, because internally you dread being left out or rejected. Procurtrusive thoughts. Ever had an unwanted thought pop into your head that wouldn't go away? Intrusive or obsessive thoughts, like imagining something bad happening or fixating on a mistake, are internal triggers that can lead to repetitive actions. For instance, a worry about germs might trigger an urge to wash hands repeatedly. The thought occurs, and without fully realizing, you act on it to relieve your anxiety. Physical or bodily sensations. Our body can send internal cues that trigger behavior. Hunger is a classic example. When your blood sugar drops, you may get irritable or hangry and reach for food impulsively. In fact, psychologists have confirmed that being hangry is a real phenomenon. Hunger is associated with stronger feelings of anger and irritability, and a drop in overall mood in everyday life. Many of us have snapped at a loved one or lost our patience simply because an internal trigger, hunger, set our mood on edge without us realizing it. Other physical states like fatigue, pain, or hormonal changes can likewise trigger emotions and behaviors. For example, feeling exhausted might trigger procrastination or giving up on work for the day. These internal triggers often operate subconsciously. You might notice the action you take, grabbing a snack, turning on the TV, procrastinating, but not catch the internal trigger that prompted it. Importantly, internal triggers don't excuse our actions, but they do explain them. By identifying the trigger, I'm actually anxious right now, that's why I'm reaching for a cigarette, we put the power back in our hands to change the response. Negative emotions deserve special attention because they are some of the most powerful internal triggers driving why we do things without thinking. Human brains are wired to respond strongly to negative stimuli. As a survival mechanism, we're attuned to threats or discomfort more than to neutral or positive signals. Thus, an unpleasant emotion will loudly trigger us to take action. Often the action is aimed at escaping or soothing the bad feeling. For example, stress or frustration, coping habits. When you get stressed, you might automatically light a cigarette, pour a drink, or binge-eat comfort food. You didn't consciously decide, I will eat a tub of ice cream because work was hard. Rather, your brain felt stress and immediately craved relief, triggering a habit loop. A moment of tension or frustration can cue behaviors like nail-biting or mindless social media scrolling as coping mechanisms. The internal trigger, stress, sparks an almost reflexive action to calm down, even if the relief is temporary. Boredom. Instant stimulation. Boredom is a mild negative emotion, but a powerful trigger of habitual behavior. If you've ever opened and closed apps on your phone repeatedly, or wandered to the fridge with no real hunger, boredom was likely the silent instigator. One tech industry insight noted that boredom frequently prompts people to seek novelty, like checking YouTube or news feeds, without any conscious plan. The uncomfortable feeling of nothing interesting is happening triggers a quick fix. Find something stimulating, now. Next thing you know, you've lost an hour to scrolling, and you barely remember how it started. Fear and anxiety. Fight, flight, or freeze. Fear is an evolutionary trigger that can hijack our behavior in an instant. When an internal alarm of fear or anxiety goes off, it can trigger a fight or flight response before we consciously register it. Your heart races. You might lash out or withdraw. For instance, social anxiety, fear of embarrassment, might trigger you to abruptly leave a gathering or avoid speaking up, almost instinctively. Fear of failure might trigger procrastination. You suddenly feel the urge to tidy your desk or check email when facing a scary task, as a way to escape the source of anxiety. These reactions happen because your emotional brain is sounding a loud siren. When emotional triggers hijack the brain. Being triggered emotionally is not just a saying. There's a biological process behind it. Intense internal triggers can actually bypass our rational thinking brain. Neuroscientists describe how, in moments of emotional trigger, the prefrontal cortex, the rational, decision-making part of the brain, essentially gets hijacked by the limbic system, the reactive, emotional part. In a triggered state, your ability to reason, plan, and consider consequences is temporarily blocked by an emotional flood. You are, in a very real sense, not thinking clearly. The trigger is driving the bus. This is why someone who is triggered might do things that seem irrational or out of character, like throwing something in anger or freezing up in panic. The logical brain has gone offline. The emotional trigger is running the show. Consider an example. Someone who once had an abusive relationship finds that during a normal disagreement with their new partner, they suddenly feel panic and despair. There's no obvious external cause for such an extreme reaction. Nothing threatening is happening now. What occurred is an internal trigger. A feeling of criticism or self-doubt stirred up old emotional pain. That familiar feeling unconsciously resurfaced memories of past abuse, sending the person into an outsized emotional tailspin. Without recognizing the trigger, they might spiral into distress or lash out, essentially reliving the past without realizing it's the past driving the reaction. This shows how internal emotional triggers, especially those tied to trauma or deep-seated fears, can ignite actions that seem inexplicable to ourselves and others. We lose it or shut down, and only afterwards do we realize that our reaction was much bigger than the situation deserved. The key point is that emotional triggers often make us react first and think later. Whether it's a small daily frustration or a deep trauma being tapped, internal emotional cues can set off automatic responses that bypass our usual filters. We might comfort ourselves, defend ourselves, or escape the situation, all without a deliberate plan, simply following the trigger. Not all internal triggers are emotional in nature. Some are more about how our thinking is unconsciously steered by mental shortcuts and biases. Our brains like to be efficient, which means we often rely on automatic thought patterns to make decisions quickly. These mental reflexes can be thought of as cognitive triggers. Certain cues or information will trigger a preconceived bias or script in our minds, leading us to a decision or behavior without thorough deliberation. Psychologists refer to these mental shortcuts as cognitive biases or heuristic triggers. In essence, our brains are persuaded by certain unconscious triggers that influence our decision-making. We like to imagine we're rational beings making well-considered choices, but in reality, we're often nudged by how information is presented or by ingrained biases, and only after we act do we rationalize our choice. Here are a few common cognitive triggers and how they make us act without realizing. Anchoring effect. The first piece of information we encounter on a topic often serves as an anchor that biases our judgment going forward. For example, if the first price you see for a product is $700, and then you see a second option for $400, your brain anchors on $700, and suddenly, $400 feels like a bargain worth jumping on. You might hastily purchase the $400 option, thinking you're being logical, it's cheaper than $700. In truth, you were triggered by the initial high price, which subconsciously set your expectations. Marketers exploit this by showing an expensive compare-it price first, or listing a costly deluxe option so that the standard option looks reasonable by comparison. You make a decision swayed by the anchor trigger, all the while believing it was your independent choice. Affiliate and priming. Our decisions are heavily influenced by what information is top of mind or easily available to our memory. If we recently heard about a plane crash on the news, we might instinctively choose to drive rather than fly. Not because of careful analysis, but because the vivid recent memory primes us to overestimate the risk of flying. In one classic demonstration of unconscious priming, shoppers in a store were influenced by background music. When French music played, people bought significantly more French wine, and when German music played, German wine sales rose. Yet when asked, nearly all the customers denied the music had any effect on their purchase. The cultural tunes made certain national wines more available in the shoppers' minds, triggering a preference without anyone realizing it. This is a perfect example of an external cue triggering an internal bias, a familiarity or affinity for the culture associated with the music, and swaying behavior subtly. Social proof and bandwagon triggers. We are social creatures, and one of our strong unconscious triggers is the behavior of others. If everyone around us seems to be choosing option A, we have a bias to lean towards option A as well, often without overt reasoning. This is known as the bandwagon effect or social proof trigger. Seeing others do something provides a mental shortcut that this is the correct or popular choice. For instance, you might find yourself laughing at a joke because everyone else is laughing, even if you didn't find it funny. Or you might join a long line for a food truck assuming the food must be good if so many people want it. Social proof triggers us to conform. One darkly comic example is how we can be manipulated by fake social proof. Seeing 5-star reviews or hearing a product is #1 best-selling can trigger trust and interest, even if those reviews were bought or the ranking is just marketing. As a dark psychology author notes, when we're uncertain, we look to our surroundings, people, celebrities, influencers, to decide what's right, and this tendency can be used to sway our perception without us realizing it. Pipeline triggers. Similarly, our brains have a built-in trigger for authority figures. We tend to comply with instructions or suggestions from someone we perceive as an authority, often bypassing our own critical thinking. In a classic example, people might blindly follow medical advice if a person in a lab coat or with doctor in their title gives it, even if the advice is questionable, simply because the symbol of authority, the coat, the title, triggers a sense of trust and obedience. This trigger was famously demonstrated in the Milgram experiment in the 1960s, where participants delivered what they thought were painful electric shocks to others because a researcher in a gray lab coat calmly told them to continue. Despite feeling uneasy, many people kept going, essentially on autopilot under authority's trigger. In everyday life, you might defer to a confident-sounding coworker's decision or follow a popular guru's advice unquestioningly due to this internal trigger to obey perceived experts. These cognitive triggers show that a lot of our decisions are influenced by hidden defaults and biases. Our brain takes quick shortcuts. Others are doing it, so it must be right. Or, the first thing I saw seems like the standard. Or, an expert said so, it must be true. We act on these cues without full awareness, and later our storytelling brain makes up a justification, like, I chose this because it's better quality, when in fact we were nudged by a trigger all along. Being aware of these mental triggers can be eye-opening. It explains why advertising, social media, and even the layout of choices we're given have such a big impact on our behavior. For instance, simply rearranging options can trigger different choices. The first option listed might get picked most due to anchoring or default bias. Tech and marketing professionals often intentionally design triggers. Scarcity triggers, like a timer counting down on a sale, tap into our fear of missing out and prompt us to buy impulsively, while reciprocity triggers, like a free gift, make us feel obliged to return the favor and perhaps purchase something. None of these strategies force anyone's hand, but they exploit our internal trigger responses. fear, urgency, obligation, to steer our actions at a subconscious level. Up to now, we've discussed how triggers operate naturally within us. Unfortunately, these same mechanisms can be deliberately exploited by others. This is where dark psychology comes into play, the use of psychological principles in manipulative, coercive ways. Manipulators understand that if they can trigger certain feelings in you, they can influence your behavior while you believe it's your own choice. Let's look at how dark psychology tactics prey on internal triggers. Fear as a trigger for control. Fear is one of the most potent triggers. Manipulators often exploit primal fears, fear of harm, fear of loss, fear of rejection, to drive people to act in desired ways. A cult leader might paint doomsday scenarios to trigger followers' fear and then present himself as the savior solution, prompting compliance. Politicians sometimes use fear-mongering. By amplifying a threat, real or imagined, they trigger public fear, which can make people accept extreme policies or rally behind the leader for protection. In personal relationships, a partner might subtly threaten to leave, triggering your fear of abandonment, to coerce you into doing what they want. Fear bypasses rational debate. It puts us straight into fight or flight mode, which a manipulator can then channel towards their desired outcome, e.g., I must obey or something bad will happen. Guilt and obligation triggers. Guilt is another strong internal trigger that manipulators wield like a weapon. Guilt tripping involves making someone feel responsible for your feelings or for a situation, so that the person is triggered to relieve their guilt by acceding to your demands. For instance, a friend might say, I guess you don't care about me at all, since you didn't come help me yesterday, instilling guilt in you. That guilt internally triggers a need to make it right. You might immediately agree to any favor they ask next. Manipulative people expertly craft messages that trigger your sense of obligation. After all I've sacrificed for you, or if you really loved me, you would do this. These phrases plant the seed of guilt or duty, and before you know it, you're doing something not out of free will, but as a reflex to stop feeling guilty. In your mind, you might justify it as kindness or loyalty, but in reality, your behavior was guided by a guilt trigger someone else pulled. Male, fear plus guilt combo. A particularly insidious tactic is when manipulators combine fear and guilt, sometimes referred to as fog, fear, obligation, guilt. For example, a manipulative family member might say, if you don't do as I ask, I don't know how I'll cope. I might just fall apart. Do you want that on your conscience? This statement triggers fear, that something bad will happen to them, and guilt, that you'll be responsible. Under that double trigger, people often cave quickly to the manipulator's request, just to avoid the crushing anxiety and guilt. Telts bombing and emotional dependency. Not all trigger exploitation is negative emotions. Some involve overwhelming someone with positive stimuli to lower their guard. Love bombing is a tactic where a person showers you with affection, praise, and attention, triggering a euphoric high and fast attachment. This avalanche of love triggers your brain's reward centers. You feel valued, loved, special. But it's a setup. Once you're hooked and emotionally dependent, the manipulator pulls back the affection as a trigger of anxiety. The sudden absence triggers you to chase their approval and comply with their wishes to get the good feelings back. Because the internal trigger, the desperate longing when the affection is withdrawn, is so powerful, victims often don't realize they're being controlled. They just feel they need to earn that love again. Exploiting cognitive biases. As discussed earlier, our minds have default triggers like authority and social proof, and manipulators use these as well. Feigning authority, e.g. scammers impersonating police or bank officials, triggers trust and obedience, so victims hand over information or money. Creating fake social proof, such as hiring fake crowds or posting fake reviews, triggers our bandwagon instinct, making us believe everyone else is doing it, so it must be right, leading us to follow along. A manipulator might orchestrate situations where you overhear praise about them or see many others agreeing with them, triggering you to doubt your own perspective and go with the group. They may also use the scarcity trigger, deliberately making something seem rare or urgent. This is a one-time offer. You have to decide now. To override your careful consideration with a rush of FOMO, fear of missing out. Playing on insecurities and desires. Emotional manipulators will identify a person's core insecurities or strong desires and target those triggers relentlessly. If you deeply desire approval, a manipulator will give you praise and then subtly withdraw it to make you work harder for their approval, triggering your desire for validation every time you slip. If you're insecure about your competence, a manipulative coworker might exploit that by alternately flattering you and then doubting you, keeping you triggered to prove yourself. These tactics work by keeping you off balance. Your emotions oscillate and triggers fire, making you easier to control. The dark truth is, manipulators are skilled at pushing your internal buttons. They rely on the fact that when you're in a triggered state, whether frightened, guilty, flattered, or excited, you're more likely to act automatically rather than rationally. As one guide on psychological manipulation notes, these tactics are effective because they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology. Understanding this is crucial to protect yourself. If you can recognize when you're feeling a sudden, strong internal trigger in someone's presence or due to someone's words, it's a red flag that you may be intentionally being provoked or steered. For example, you're negotiating a purchase and the seller creates a crisis atmosphere. 10 other people are lined up for this. You'll lose it if you don't act now. Your heart pounds and you feel panicked to act. Realizing I'm being triggered by fear of loss can help you step back and regain control before you make a rash decision. In summary, dark psychology is all about hijacking the trigger action wiring in our brains for someone else's benefit. They can't mind control you in a sci-fi sense, but by invoking the right triggers, they can strongly influence you to behave in certain ways while you think you're freely choosing. This makes it all the more important to shine a light on our own triggers and learn to manage them. Which leads us to our final section. By now, it's clear that many of the things we do without realizing are not random at all. They are triggered. Our internal triggers, emotions, thoughts, physical needs, and external triggers, cues around us, create a web of cause and effect that drives our habits and reactions. The good news is that understanding your triggers is the first step to regaining control over those automatic behaviors. As one habit expert put it, most people overestimate motivation and underestimate triggers. Once you see what actually starts a behavior, it feels less like a mystery and more like a system. In other words, your actions are not inexplicable quirks. They follow patterns. And if you can identify the triggers in those patterns, you can begin to change the outcomes. Here are some strategies to help you recognize and manage your triggers. 1. Build awareness of your trigger action patterns. Start observing your own behavior like a scientist. When you catch yourself in an unconscious habit, e.g., scrolling, snacking, nail biting, sudden mood shifts, pause and ask, what am I feeling or what just happened right before I did this? Keep a journal or log for a week where you note significant actions and what preceded them. Time of day, emotional state, environment. You might discover, for example, that you always reach for sweets at 3 p.m. out of boredom, or you get argumentative whenever you read news in the evening, perhaps triggered by accumulated stress. Patterns will emerge, and you'll start spotting the triggers, a certain mood, a thought, a context, that were previously invisible. This awareness itself lessens the power of triggers, because you can anticipate and plan for them. 2. Regos your emotions and urges. When a strong emotion hits, name it to tame it. Researchers have found that simply identifying what you feel, I am anxious, I am angry because I feel disrespected, engages the thinking part of your brain and reduces the limbic hijack. For instance, remember the hangry phenomenon. People often don't realize they're acting irritable due to hunger until it's pointed out. Psychologists advise that if we can label the feeling, I'm not actually mad at my friend, I'm just hungry and on edge, we're better able to address it constructively. The same goes for urges. If you suddenly feel compelled to, say, check social media, acknowledge it. I have an urge to escape feeling bored right now. By bringing the trigger into conscious recognition, You create a space to decide your response, rather than blindly following the urge. 3. Develop healthier routines for common triggers. Once you know your frequent internal triggers, prepare alternative responses. If stress triggers you to smoke, plan a different outlet for stress, like a short walk or a 5-minute breathing exercise, and consciously choose that when you notice the trigger. If late-night loneliness triggers you to text an ex or doom-scroll social media, recognize that feeling and instead call a friend or write in a journal. Replacing the automatic reaction with a mindful action is essentially rewiring your habit loop. It won't be perfect overnight. Triggers are powerful, but each time you successfully redirect the behavior, you weaken the old trigger reaction link and strengthen a new, healthier link. 4. Guard against external manipulation. Knowledge is power, and now that you know how triggers can be used against you, keep an eye out for those tactics. If an advertisement or salesperson is pushing your fear of missing out buttons, or a peer is using guilt to pressure you, pause and engage your critical mind. Remind yourself that a triggered state, panicked, guilty, extremely excited, is when you need to slow down and think, rather than act immediately. Take a break, remove yourself from the triggering situation if possible, and evaluate the decision logically. By not giving in instantly to externally induced triggers, you rob manipulators of their power over you, and ensure your choices align with your true intentions. Finally, be patient and compassionate with yourself in this process. We all have triggers, and we all have moments when they get the better of us. The goal isn't to become an emotionless robot. It's to bring more of your actions into the light of awareness. Each time you identify a trigger and successfully manage your response, you're effectively diffusing a bomb that used to control you. You start doing things because you chose to, not because some unseen force, whether internal or external, pulled your strings. In conclusion, the triggers that make you tick don't have to run your life. They may explain why you do things without realizing, but they are not excuses to remain on autopilot. By learning about internal triggers, those emotional, psychological, and physiological cues, you've taken the crucial first step toward mastering them. Remember, what we can name and understand, we can often tame. So next time you catch yourself in an unexplained behavior, take a moment to pause and ask, what triggered this? The simple act of asking the question brings you back into consciousness. Over time, you'll find that understanding your triggers not only helps you break bad habits and make better decisions, but also shields you from those who would exploit your unconscious tendencies. You gain insight into your own mind's workings, a form of self-defense and self-improvement all in one. Why we do things without realizing it is no longer an unsolvable mystery or solely dark magic. It's a predictable pattern of triggers and responses. And with this knowledge, you hold the keys to break the pattern. Stay curious, stay aware, and you'll reclaim the driver's seat of your behavior, one trigger at a time.